Welcome, everyone, to our live webinar, 9/11, An Architect's Guide, a three-part series. Today is Thursday, February 11th, 2021. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization representing a growing body of now more than 3,400 architects and engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. Last week, we presented part one in this three-part series. That was about World Trade Center 7. This is part two, the Twin Towers explosive destruction, in which we'll be examining the explosive evidence and the structural dynamics of how the Twin Towers collapsed. First, let me introduce you to our operations manager and host of 9/11 Freefall, Mr. Andy Steele. Hey, Andy.
Hello, Richard. Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in today. I just want to let everyone know that I'm here to help with technical glitches, which will occur from time to time. Also, we'll be happy to take your questions at the end of the webinar today. The best way to submit them is to go to our website, ae911truth.org. You'll see in the menu at the top that there's a section that says continuing education. Select that and then select the live webinars, and you'll see there's a box to type them right in there. Also, I'll be looking over our Facebook broadcast of this show today and the YouTube broadcast as well for any good comments or questions related to the material that Richard will be presenting. So with all that said, back to you, Richard.
And thank you, sir. And just so people know something about my background, I was responsible at a local firm here in the San Francisco Bay Area for the construction documents for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums and the construction administration for this $125 million high school. More recently, before launching full-time into this important outreach effort, I had similar responsibilities working on this $400 million mixed-use project near Las Vegas with 6 blocks of retail, mid-rise office space, and parking structure. Altogether, about 1,200 tons of fireproof steel framing. I now work full-time educating architects, engineers, and others to understand what really happened to the World Trade Center using the material in these courses. So with that said, let's get right into it. The Twin Towers. Let's look at the design first. Some just almost completely dismiss this aspect of the World Trade Center. I mean, it was really rather extraordinary. Some called it the crowning achievement of the international style. Others, heartless modernism. Robert Stern calls it gigantic dumbness, right? You just extrude 2 squares until they become taller than the tallest building in the world, which at the time was the Empire State Building, which you can see by its beautiful unfolding massing. Back then we had a different design aesthetic, we'll call it, that we put into our buildings. But the engineering innovations were rather extraordinary, beginning with the elevator design. We had to get 50,000 occupants into their offices and 140,000 visitors every day. How were they going to accomplish that? With 100 elevator cabs in each of these towers. So they stop at third points, shift elevators, and go up to their succeeding level for the second and third sections of these buildings. That was a new concept in elevator design. But even more extraordinary was the structural innovations here. The Twin Towers superseded a structural strategy which put columns every 20 feet or so throughout the building, severely impacting the design capability of the tenants who wanted to move in. But what they did with the Twin Towers is move half the structure outside in an exoskeleton with 3 vertical columns and 3 horizontal spandrel panels tying them together, welded in the shop. They brought out and they erected these in the field, as you see. In the center, we have the remaining columns, 42 massive core columns At the bottom, 52 inches by 22 inches solid steel and thinning to the top. In between these two structures, we have these long span, lightweight steel trusses with poured concrete floors over the top of them, spanning up to 60 feet on two sides, as you see here, and 35 feet on the other sides. So the what that did, though, was, well, in addition to creating an acre size floor plate, an extraordinary amount of space up in the sky there, each floor, but this had some downsides too. The columns marching around, some likened it to a jail cell, because as the 80s developed even greater structural capabilities in these tall buildings, the windows began to get larger and larger. They had picturesque views. So already this building was outdated in 10 years. Not just because of that, but because of the electrical communications and mechanical systems that needed to be upgraded already, certainly by the 90s. And the ceilings were taller in skyscrapers that came along in the 80s and 90s. So these were, by some researchers' accounts, not inhabitable. They had to pay people to and give huge discounts to get tenants to come in to the building, and leveraging them and forcing them and so forth. They were only half occupied by some researchers' accounts, but at the time of 2001. So they were white elephants. So why would a developer come in and purchase from the publicly held public organization, the Port Authority of New Jersey and New York? They've sold it to private hands, which, in a deal that culminated just 6 weeks prior to 9/11, we have Larry Silverstein leveraging $15 million of his own money up to $3.2 billion somehow, in a deal that has had lots of problems with it. So we'll come back to Mr. Silverstein later, but yeah, we already did talk about him last week, if you recall, relative to Building 7, the third tower that collapsed on 9/11. If you missed part 1 in this series, be sure to see that. It's free on YouTube. Well, with all that said, let's jump in and see how this story developed that morning.
On September 11th, we learned that 4 passenger planes were hijacked and taken radically off course. Within an hour, 2 of the planes had flown into the enormous steel towers of the World Trade Center, creating fires and eventually toppling them. Dazed by the news, the American public soon believed the fires in the towers had burned so hot they caused the steel frames of the buildings to give way. A myth developed, fed by official sources through the media to a bewildered audience. Elements of the myth. The impact of the airplanes, gallons of burning jet fuel, steel melting, the buildings failing and suddenly imploding. In a mere 10 seconds, 110 stories hurtled earthward, pulverizing into dust. Right from the start, on the street itself, the official story was born.
Come out of nowhere and just scream right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
The myth bled into the FEMA report. and was echoed by the experts.
It was the combination of the impact load doing great damage to the building, followed by the fire, that caused collapse.
Well, there's the official story in a nutshell. Right there of Gene Corley. Maybe it came from that bozo who was with the Fox News hat, the first one to be interviewed. So that what you just saw. Either way, structural engineers have been arguing about this for years and years and continue to, as you'll see. Well, let's see what Nist says. The North Tower was hit at 8:46 in the morning. It doesn't collapse until an hour and a half or so after that. So a lot of people associate the collapse of the towers to the incredible explosion of jet fuel that occurred. But no, it occurs an hour and a half later. In the case of the South Tower, hit 9 o'clock, it occurs only an hour later, its collapse. So Nist acknowledges that 90%, Nist is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, by the way, who was tasked by Congress to explain these collapses to the American people. They acknowledge that 90% of the jet fuel burned up outside the building, which is why you have a huge explosion of jet fuel. The rest of it was gone in 10 minutes. So all it did is serve to start the fire. And so we have normal office fires here and some damage by the airplanes to the columns. So keep that in mind because it's quite important. Even officials investigating this couldn't come to consistent conclusions whatsoever, starting with the American Society of Civil Engineers, who put forth hand-picked volunteers who worked themselves into the subsequent investigations of this subject, such as FEMA, which finally had some funding, $600,000. They just dribbled out this funding, but their efforts were hampered. They couldn't get access to the blueprints, to the site, to the public, to get photographs and so forth. It was really quite a problem for them. This was documented in the New York Times. They came out with what was to be called the Pancake Theory, which Nist, when they came out with their report in 2005, completely turned it around. Came out with what they call the column failure theory. Well, they had $20 million in funding. Now, Nist is part of the Department of Commerce, who's the head of which, and the head of Nist, was replaced when the Bush administration came into power shortly before 9/11. It was a year or so. Anyway, the column failure theory goes like this. This huge fire caused these floor trusses to sag. And when they did, this caused the perimeter columns to buckle or to bow inward. And, that's intuitive. We can kind of understand that, except that, as we'll show you, the fires weren't huge at the time of the collapse, and sagging columns can't pull in these perimeter, sagging floor trusses can't pull in these perimeter columns. There's not enough lateral force. There's 14-inch square steel tube columns here, every 3 feet 4 inches all the way around the building. So we'll talk more about that. But what Nist had to do in their computer modeling in order to get this building to fail in their computer was to impose an artificial 5,000-pound load on these columns equally where they attach to the trusses, equally all the way around the building, forcing the building to fail and initiate their collapse. So keep that in mind also. The fraud that we're going to be looking at here is evident every step of the way, not the least of which is the claim that these fires were out of control at the time of the collapse, causing those floor trusses to sag. Well, no. In fact, in the South Tower, in the North Tower, the fire is diminished at the time of the collapse, indicated by the thick black smoke. They're oxygen-starved and cooler fires. So they're not going to be causing such collapse of the floor trusses. And we'll talk about what does cause such a collapse in a moment. But this is why we use the scientific method at Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. What is that? Well, we've had it for a year, 100 years or so in the West. It's how we winnow error from truth, fact from fiction. We have a question. How did the towers come down? We do some background research. Okay, we make observations. Based on these, we come up with a hypothesis. This is our best guess as to how the towers came down. It's an untested hypothesis. We make predictions. So one hypothesis might be that the planes impacting the columns brought it down. That's a reasonable place to start. So is fires, because there were fires up there. And as we'll see today, explosions, lots of evidence of explosions and controlled demolition. We'll be looking at those hypotheses today. You see, all the hypotheses are laid out without respect to our own personal financial or political obligations, which might sway our objective opinion in the matter of how this building came down. It's an objective process. That's the whole point of the scientific method. We test those hypotheses and those predictions based on with experiments. We analyze the results. We draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner. We don't hide the computer input data in a black box that's not available to peer-reviewed inspection, for instance, like we talked about last week with respect to Building 7, where they denied showing this to us. We had to do a Freedom of Information request. And the only out that they had was that it might jeopardize public safety if they were to release that information. That's one of the exceptions that they could use, and they did. Well, wait a minute. Doesn't it jeopardize public safety to withhold from the architects and engineers the information we need to ensure that our buildings are safe? We are tasked with ensuring the safety of our buildings. So it makes no sense whatsoever. They thought maybe terrorists could get hold of these plans and find out how future high-rise buildings might be used, manipulated, where the weak points are, where they could put explosives or something. That information is accessible anyway. So anyway, if the hypothesis is not corroborated, like we saw last week, we go back, we try again, we construct a new hypothesis, and so on, until we have a hypothesis that is corroborated by the evidence. That's what we're about today. So we start with performing some research. What are the forces that destroy buildings? Well, fire is certainly one of them. It's an organic, a chaotic process. It follows the laws of entropy. So if a building is going to collapse due to fire, not that we've ever lost a high rise, but say in a wood frame building, it would begin to fall over in stages because the structure itself is combustible in not tall buildings, but in shorter buildings. Plus, there's only enough in tall buildings, a modern office skyscraper, for instance, there's only enough fuel to burn in 20 minutes or so. It's not an inexhaustible fuel supply, so as is implied by Nist's column failure theory that we just discussed. In fact, they actually acknowledge this, which is known very well throughout the fire prevention community, that fires did not persist in any one location for more than about 20 or 30 minutes. So skyscrapers don't collapse. We'll look more at that. But in wood frame buildings, again, they would fall to the path of least resistance. they'd fall over. They don't go straight down through the tons of structure that's cold, hard, and intact below. So we looked at the last week, the video of an 8-story building built out of steel frame construction, some of which was fireproofed and some of which was not, to see what happens. This is the most intense, largest study of its kind. You can see the 2,000-degree fires that were set in this building due they were trying to reach those temperatures with all of this kindling stacked up in there. Really wanted to get the worst case whatsoever. You can see that the beams sagged, but they did not fail. The connections do not fail in fires. They are the strongest part of the building because that's where things can go wrong. So they're over-designed. The executive summary cites that this is an inherently stable behavior in these buildings due to the highly redundant nature of the structural steel form. Even where there's no cementitious fireproofing on these columns and beams, we still do not have failure in fires that are easily twice the temperatures that normal office fires ever get to. In fact, we haven't lost a skyscraper, steel frame fireproof skyscraper yet. Take a look.
May 4th, 1988, the first Interstate Bank, a 62-story building in Los Angeles, California, suffered a 3.5-hour fire which burned across 5 floors and caused an estimated $200 million of damage. It did not collapse. February 23rd, 1991, the One Meridian Plaza, a 38-story building in Philadelphia, suffered an 18-hour fire which burned across 8 floors. The fire caused an estimated $100 million worth of damage and 3 firefighters died fighting it. It was later described by officials as the most significant fire of the century. It did not collapse. October 17th, 2004, the East Tower of the Park Central complex in Caracas, Venezuela, suffered a 17-hour fire which spread across 26 of its 56 floors. It did not collapse. August 18th, 2007, a fire broke out on the 17th floor of the Deutsche Bank building in New York, a building undergoing deconstruction after being heavily damaged by debris from the South Tower on 9/11. Originally 41 stories in height, it had been reduced to 26 at the time of the fire, which lasted 7 hours and affected a total of 10 floors. 2 firefighters died of smoke inhalation. It did not collapse. On 9/11 itself, 5 World Trade Center, a 9-story building east of the North Tower, was engulfed in flames after sustaining heavy damage from falling debris. A number of partial collapses occurred, but the overall structure remained standing. February 9th, 2009, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Beijing was completely engulfed in flames for more than 3 hours during the Lunar New Year celebrations. The fire affected all 44 floors, igniting fireworks as it burned. 1 firefighter died fighting it. It did not collapse. May 4th,
So none of them did. In fact, neither did these high-rise structures where they are fully engulfed top to bottom. They didn't collapse either. Why not? And yet the Twin Towers, which had these few small fires diminished at the time of the collapse, caused the complete destruction of those buildings. So you already see this huge discrepancy that we have from reality, the actual fires and skyscrapers and what they can't do to these steel frame fireproof skyscrapers, and unreality, what we're told happened. So keep this in mind. Now, how do buildings behave in natural collapses? This case, due to earthquakes. We have a building that falls over, but it's recognizable as a building. And we'll compare that to the piles that we're going to see in the aftermath of the Twin Towers. The columns and the beams are not severed one from another. The concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder. So keep that in mind when we go back also and look. Now these buildings, look when we look at the Twin Towers, these buildings have been exploded, blown up. We have thick, billowing, enormous pyroclastic, like expanding cauliflower-shaped forms of smoke and created by the incredible heat from the ignition of the chemicals in these explosives. We have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. If you have these features, you know you have explosions. And of course, explosions can be harnessed quite effectively to bring down tall buildings. This is called controlled demolition. There's half a dozen or so companies that are capable of doing this. Fire doesn't do this to a building. Never has and never will. How do they do it? They study the structure very intensely. They place shaped cutter charges in the columns and beams throughout the building, thousands of them, in order to bring the building down precisely the way they want it, often straight down, often at free fall or near free fall acceleration. So keep this in mind too as we proceed, that this is a viable hypothesis. Now, typical controlled demolitions have a set of features that go along with them. There's a sudden onset of destruction, usually at the base of the structure, but not always. There's a straight down symmetrical or nearly symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint, if that's what they're trying to achieve. Feature number 3 is a result of those removing the columns all around at once. So the columns are severed in order to facilitate those features. And feature number 4, a free fall or near free fall acceleration straight down through what should have been the greatest path of resistance. But no, it comes down even faster. And we'll take a look at how fast these buildings come down. Feature number 5, then there's a total dismemberment of the structural steel frame. That's very different than how buildings fall naturally, as we saw just earlier. Feature number 6, limited damage to adjacent structures. At least that's the goal of normal controlled demolition. And there's witnesses that hear explosions and see flashes of light. We'll be looking at that. We have broken up concrete floors in typical controlled demolitions, and we certainly have that, as you'll see here. Explosive charges left behind in the residue. If we have residue of explosives or incendiaries, we certainly can use that as evidence for a controlled demolition. And what I meant here on feature number 9 is isolated explosive ejections occurring throughout the building. There are obviously explosions, and there's no other rational cause for them other than explosions. So we'll see these in the Twin Towers coming up. And we also then have the residue of explosives and or incendiaries in the Twin Towers, typically high energy explosives in normal controlled demolition. And we'll talk about the differences, those differences. But all this is direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create any one of these, let alone all 10 of them. So it's going to be very easy to distinguish what an explosive demolition is versus what a damage by fire can do. Fires cause structures to collapse asymmetrically with gradual deformation following the path of least resistance. And why haven't we had a fire bring down a skyscraper? Well, one reason is the steel conducts that heat away because it's so dense. It just away from the source. So the steel at the source doesn't really rarely gets to 1200 degrees unless the fire is extremely hot. 1200 degrees Fahrenheit, at which steel can lose half of its strength and begin to sag. And that happened in those tests. But that's why they wanted to know what would happen without fireproofing. But in order to keep that from happening, we put cementitious fireproofing, 2 and 3 hour fire protection. What does that mean? That's 4 to 6 times as much fire protection as we need. Because remember, fires are only in an area in a modern office building about 20 to 30 minutes. So we have 4 to 6 times as much protection as is needed here. It's a very conservative design. So we also have, we keep the tenants from bringing in large fuel loads in these buildings. We keep the contractors from building these buildings out of combustible materials. So that's all very helpful. And we put in fire sprinklers to keep any or all of that from becoming a problem. So fire sprinklers were said to have been damaged, but at least the water to the sprinklers, by the impact of the airplanes in the case of the Twin Towers. So we don't argue that point. We just show evidence that is compelling, as you'll see, that has caused 3,400 architects and engineers to demand a new investigation. Evidence that's backed up by foreknowledge of the destruction, government documentation. You have to get a permit to bring buildings down. You don't just do this in a day, especially while a building is on fire. With experts agreeing, yeah, that's a controlled demolition, at least those experts without financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion in the matter. And video documentation, all that can be proof of controlled demolition. A body of proof that we're going to apply right now to the Twin Towers, beginning with feature number 1. Is there a sudden onset of destruction in this building? Well, let's look. Here's the North Tower. It's standing there fine, and all of a sudden, there's a drop of the building, a smooth, sudden drop. No jolt, no hesitation, no impacting one floor onto another. No resistance, or very, very little resistance provided by the columns. So this is a huge problem for the official story in and of itself. Let's go to the South Tower. Same situation. The building is standing still, and all of a sudden it begins to drop suddenly. And so we have problems there too. Let's look and see if there are patterned explosions and flashes of light heard and seen by witnesses. Let's start with about 118 of them, the oral histories of the first responders, which were ordered by City Fire Commissioner Thomas Von Eschen. They were recorded on tape. And we didn't know about this because it was held in secret by the city of New York. They wouldn't release it. And finally, the court ordered them to. And boy, did we learn something. The New York Times published these transcripts on their website. And what did we find? 118 of these firefighters and other first responders observing flashes, sounds of explosions, and other phenomena indicative of explosive demolition. Let's look at a few of them. We felt the ground shake. You could see the towers sway, and then it just came down. Now, I'm going to show you a bunch of these quotes. And what you're going to see is a specific order of events. They saw or they felt this phenomena before the towers coming down. We're told by the official story, Nist, that the towers coming down caused these sounds of explosions and the ground shaking. But again and again, these experts in their fields, these credible witnesses, are being very specific with their testimony. All of a sudden, the ground just started shaking. Felt like a train running under my feet. The next thing we know, we look up and the tower is collapsing. It shook my bones. Shortly before the first tower came down, I remember feeling the ground shaking. I heard a terrible noise, and then debris just started flying everywhere. An explosion appeared at the very top. Simultaneously, from all four sides, materials shot out horizontally. And then there seemed to be a momentary delay before you could see the beginning of the collapse. I saw a flash, flash, flash. You know, like when they demolished the building, and this was at the lower level of the building. The building collapse started at the top. What's going on down here? There was an explosion in the South Tower, one floor under another. When it hit about the 5th floor, I figure it was a bomb because it looked like a synchronized, deliberate kind of thing. I saw a flash, flash, flash at the lower level of the building once again. Nothing's supposed to be happening at the lower level. All the action is up top. That's what we're told. But these witnesses confirm something else. You know, like when they demolish a building. It seemed like on television when they blow up these buildings, it seemed like it was going all the way around like a belt, all these explosions. Now let's see what they're talking about. Here's the North Tower on the right, a known controlled demolition on the left. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity, slowing it down to half speed, to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? Especially since fire, the official cause of this building, of this collapse, has never brought down a skyscraper. Shouldn't it have been the first hypothesis, explosions and controlled demolition, that made any real sense here? But no, it was relegated to years later, answering it in a set of very frequently asked questions to Nist, which they didn't publish for many years. So the question, why didn't Nist consider a controlled demolition hypothesis with matching computer modeling and explanation like it did for the Pancake Theory hypothesis? Well, gosh, hey, shut up. We interviewed 200 technical experts, 125 leading experts, reviewed tens of thousands of documents, interviewed more than 1,000 people, 7,000 segments of video footage, 7,000 photographs. So go away is the intent of that appeal to authority. They also say we don't support the controlled demolition collapse theory. The collapse was initiated in the impact and fire floors and nowhere else, implying that most demolitions occur by explosions down low, which, by the way, you just saw were seen by the first responders. But here we have and we'll show you that controlled demolitions can also start up above. Video evidence also showed unambiguously that the collapse progressed from the top to the bottom. No evidence of any blasts or explosions in the region below the impact. Well, we just showed you eyewitness testimony of such, and we'll show you some more evidence too, visual evidence of explosions there. Nist found no corroborating evidence for alternative hypotheses suggesting that the Twin Towers were brought down by controlled demolition. So they make their case here only years after, because they were hounded by these kinds of questions. Back to the witnesses. You ever see professional demolition where they set charges on certain floors and you hear the pop, pop, pop? When I heard that friggin' noise, that's when I saw the building coming down. Somewhere around the middle of the World Trade Center, there was this orange and red flash coming out. Initially, it was just one flash. Then this flash just kept popping all the way around the building, and that building had started to explode. Saw a number of brief light sources being emitted from inside the building between floors 10 and 15. Remember, the plane hits way up high in the building. What's going on down here? He saw about 6 of these brief flashes accompanied by a crackling sound before the tower collapsed. I saw low-level flashes. I saw flash, 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 and then it looked like the building came down. The building was blowing out on all 4 sides. We actually heard the pops. You know, you heard the pops of the building. With each popping sound, initially an orange and then a red flash came out of the building. Then it would just go all the way around the building on both sides. Let's look at the South Tower and see what these guys are talking about on the right, compared to a known controlled demolition on the left. Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? Yeah, you'd think so, right? I thought the terrorists planted explosives somewhere in the building. That's how loud it was. A crackling explosive. Another loud boom at the upper floors. And then there was a series of smaller explosions which appeared to go completely around the building at the upper floors. And another loud earth-shattering blast with large fireball which blew out more debris. The lower level of the building, you know, like when they demolish a building, that's what I thought I saw. Did you see any flashes? I said, yes. Well, I thought it was just me. He said, no, I saw them too. Everybody at this point still thought these things were blown up. So I was fully expecting anything else to blow up. You were there when the planes hit? I said, no, I was there when the building exploded. You mean when it fell down? No, when it exploded. Let's listen to these other witnesses.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion.
The whole building just collapsed on us inside the lobby.
Was that a secondary explosion?
Yes, it was.
That was the
planet probably.
Yeah, definitely secondary explosion.
I heard a second explosion and another rumble.
An hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much, much lower.
It just went ba-boom, it was like a bomb went off. And another explosion came right from it, just everyone flying.
There were numerous secondary explosions taking place in that building. There were continuous explosions.
No, the first explosion, and there was a second explosion in the same building. There were two explosions.
Okay. Federal agencies that were down there do believe that there was some sort of explosive device somewhere else besides the planes hitting.
There was another explosion that took place in one of the towers here. So obviously, according to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building.
There was a secondary explosion, probably a device either planted before or on the aircraft that did not explode until an hour later.
Then there was no secondary explosions and then the subsequent collapses.
That the FBI most likely thinks that there was a car or truck packed with explosives underneath the buildings, which also exploded at the same time and brought both of them down.
Now, that's the first time we're hearing that. So 2 planes and explosives that were in the building. Is that correct?
That is the working theory at this point. That is
A huge explosion now raining debris on all of us.
It sounded like gunfire, you know, bang, 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 bang. And then all of a sudden, 3 big explosions.
About 50 consecutive bangs, and it fell down like a waterfall.
And we heard the noise associated with an implosion.
We heard a very loud blast, an explosion. We looked up, and the building literally began to collapse before us.
We heard a loud explosion, and at that point, Building 2 was collapsing.
At that point, we heard a large boom. I looked up and just saw the building coming at us.
Do you know if it was an explosion or if it was a building collapse?
To me, it sounded like an explosion.
There was another major explosion. The building itself, literally the top of it came down.
All of a sudden, you hear explosion, and you could see the building starting to collapse.
Huge explosion that we all heard and felt.
We understand now there has been a secondary explosion on Tower 2.
According to the Associated Press, another building that has either been attacked or exploded.
The tower, rather, that has collapsed, we are told, collapsed because of a third explosion.
And about an hour later after that, there was a huge explosion at the base of the South Tower. That's One World Trade Center, and part of the building collapsed.
We could hear a rumble, which was about 5 seconds long, preceding the actual collapse, and then a boom when each of those towers collapsed.
Just seconds ago, there was a huge explosion, and it appears right now the Second World Trade Tower has just collapsed.
I was about 5 blocks away when I heard explosions.
And then you heard from far away, boom, boom. And you heard the boom, 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 boom.
4x4 started popping out.
It was if they had detonated.
Yeah,
They were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
From the corner, boom, 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 boom. Just like 20 straight hits. And as the bombs were going, people just started running. And I sat there and watched a few of them explode, and it just started going pop. It just started going boom, 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 boom. And he goes, how fast? I go, like firecrackers.
How many of these witnesses, and again, Nist claims they interviewed, 1,000 witnesses. How many of these ended up being interviewed or at least documented in their draft or final reports? 0. Is that important evidence? We certainly think so. Nist claims it couldn't have been a controlled demolition. It didn't start at the bottom. Well, wait a minute. Is that true? Do all controlled demolitions start at the bottom? Let's listen to Mark Loiseau of Control Demolition, Inc., the top controlled demolition company in the country.
You can go almost anywhere in the structure, and given the right circumstances, you can release all of that stored energy, converting into what is called kinetic energy. That's energy in motion, and that's what brings the building down.
There's a top-down controlled demolition. Nist says, oh, well, the upper block, after those columns bowed inward and failed, the upper block drove the rest of the building down to the ground. Well, there's a problem with this theory, not the least of which is that it violates Newton's third law of motion. There's an equal and opposite destructive force when two bodies collide. Look at it like this. A Mack truck runs into a Volkswagen. Which one gets destroyed? The Volkswagen. Does it matter if we drop the Volkswagen on top of the Mack truck? No. The lightest, weakest part of a structure can't possibly destroy the cold, hard, intact steel that's stronger and stronger and stronger as you go down the building. See, these towers are like a virtual pyramid. All high rises are. The lightest steel is up at the top with maybe 3/8 inch, 3/4 inch thick steel. And then it gets heavier and heavier. And these are actual columns from the Twin Towers till you get at mid-height. And you have 2-inch thick steel, 32 inches by 16 inches. And you continue getting thicker and thicker and thicker until you're almost solid steel at the bottom, 52 inches by 22 inches. Now, this theory comes from a paper that was written and submitted by Zdenek Bazant of Chicago Northwestern University into the Journal of Engineering Mechanics. It's a very, very convoluted paper. It's called the crush down, crush up theory. The top part crushes the rest of it and then crushes itself. And this is, interestingly, submitted 2 days after 9/11. The rest of us are in shock, trying to figure out who was attacking us and what was going on. Well, this guy is in his den working on this paper, making it so obscure that nobody could figure out how to decode it. But it remains today the key theoretical basis for Nist's theory as the collapse of the towers. So his formulas are actually correct, but the input data is completely falsified. There's 6 problems here. One, again, the calculations are obfuscated, so it took years for engineers to even decode it. And another thing he does here is completely eliminates 300 plus columns in the building, and which are 12 feet high. Completely eliminates, so we can get that false 12-foot drop without any columns supporting it to develop a dynamic impact load on the poor structure beneath, trying to get a progressive collapse to start. He doubles the mass up above, unrealistically. He decreases the column strength below by 3 times. He decreases the velocity loss that would have occurred due to the law of the conservation of momentum when hitting one floor of columns and then the next, there'd be some loss of momentum. He ignores that, and he ignores the column reserve strength. These columns are 3 to 5 times stronger than they ever need to be to hold up the building. That's completely ignored. So the results of these errors are that it's rigged 12 to 1 in favor of a collapse. This is fraud. And this fraud has been challenged, and we're pending action at the American Society of Civil Engineers. You see, what's going on here is it would have been arrested. We have time on the bottom and velocity on the left. The velocity would decrease to 0 after it met the cold, hard steel below. But no, the actual measured data by David Chandler, physics teacher, is shown here, and Nist theorized actually even greater velocity. No, almost as great velocity. So it would have stopped, and we'll talk about that some more. But these errors were challenged, and there's papers that have been submitted to the American Society of Civil Engineers and the Journal of Engineering Mechanics, but they won't publish them. Why? They say, well, gosh, it's out of scope. Well, wait a minute. Why is it out of scope for a group of engineers to challenge the veracity and fraud, actually, of a previously published paper? It makes no sense. So this has been challenged, as I mentioned, and we're pending that results of that challenge. So we have let's look at this action of this pile driver, as you could call it. And is it destroying the building below? Or let's take a look at it this way. Look at the red line at the bottom. It's not going down. The upper part is being destroyed in the first 3 seconds of this building's collapse. There's no driving down of that upper block. It's telescoping in on itself. The question is, what's destroying it? And we're going to be showing you evidence to answer that question. And so here's another way of looking at it. We start and stop, just like the firefighters described, all the way around the building, all these explosions like a belt. And whoops. And so remember, Nist's theory is that the columns bowed inward. And in fact, they did. The question is, what's causing them to bow inward? Take a look in this looped video again and again at this particular corner of the South Tower. You see these columns bowing inward at the location of the jet plane impact. Now, let's go into this a little bit. The FEMA, in their analysis, cites something very different from Nist. Take a look.
When the collapse finally starts, the antenna started just a little bit before the exterior of the building started. And that tells us that the core columns let go first.
Wait a minute. That's a problem, because Nist came along later, threw out that fact of the antenna dropping first, because they needed the exterior columns to fail first to make their theory work. But let's look at this. You can see that the antenna is dropping first. Look at the top line of the photograph. We go back to, forward to, back to, forward to. The antenna is dropping first before there's any downward movement of the perimeter at the top of this building. Well, what does the antenna sit on? It sits on the hat truss. What does the hat truss sit on? It sits on the core columns. So it would follow that the core columns are failing first, and then that causes, of course, the hat truss to go down with them, and that causes the antenna to go down with them. The question is, what's causing the core columns to fail? We'll get to that, but what's causing the perimeter structural steel columns to bow inward? Well, if the core columns are failing and pulling on the lightweight steel trusses, the lightweight steel trusses then pull on the perimeters. So this video, I think it's from FEMA, shows the overall concept, but not the specific application of the bowing of the perimeter columns. We didn't make it. But it highlights the point very well that something in the core columns, something is severed the core columns such that the entire core structure is falling first. Besides, in none of the photos or videos do we have a upper block of building driving the rest of the building down. We don't see it anywhere. It's gone. It's destroyed itself, as we saw the beginning of earlier. And if that were there, you would never see these remaining core columns, because they would have been crushed by that upper block that was crushing them. No, something else happened here. Some other destructive mechanism is at work, which then has presumably explosions, which we'll continue seeing evidence for, that shakes the dust off of these remaining core columns, and then they fall frame by frame through the dust that's been shaken off of them. It's all descending. It is not turning to dust. It's shaking the dust off of itself, which must be by explosions, as we'll continue seeing. So we have a collapse or an explosion. You know, we begin to look at the evidence through our own eyes, not with what we've been told we're seeing, but with what we're actually seeing. Looks more like a volcanic eruption in the Tongan Sea in 2009. Upward, outward, arching streamers, freely flying structural steel or solid objects trailed by thick white smoke clouds, indicating those solid objects, steel in the case of the World Trade Center, trailed by thick white smoke clouds. Steel is not flammable under office fire conditions. We'll come back to that next week in part 3 of this series when we examine the extreme heat in the World Trade Center. Does it even look like a collapse to you? If not, what does it look like? Well, to 36 reporters on the day of 9/11 who reported explosions and explosive evidence through their own eyewitness reporting, narrative reporting, source-based reporting, and non-explosion reporters. We heard a very loud blast and an explosion. This is in addition to what we've already seen. They've concluded that the hypothesis of explosions bringing down the Twin Towers was not only prevalent among reporters, but it was the dominant hypothesis. So let's see if there's a straight down symmetrical collapse. Well, the building itself, actually, in the case of the South Tower, rolls off of itself 22 degrees. So we have asymmetrical loading from this part that's falling off. We have asymmetrical damage from the airplane impacts. We have asymmetrical damage from the fires up above. How is it that we have complete symmetrical destruction all the way down each face of this four-sided building? It's a complete non sequitur. It makes no sense. Let's zoom in to part of this. And tell me what you're looking at the bottom here. Are you looking at a collapse, which is 20 stories up above this? Or you're looking at the leading wave in the corner of this building of hundreds of individual, relatively small explosions disguised to diminish any individual explosion, which become very clear here, yet nevertheless. Another view of that corner is here in the lower right. The explosions are traveling down the leading corner of this building destruction almost as fast as the freely falling debris. So they're scheduled to fall to go off a little slower. So this building doesn't quite come down at free fall, but we'll get into that in a moment. We have a 12 to 1,400 foot diameter of destruction around these 200-foot square buildings. The debris is sent out 600 feet outside the perimeter of each of these towers, well beyond the bounds of the World Trade Center complex itself, even overlapping Building 7, as you see here, which did get some damage from this debris, which we discussed in detail last week. But the Winter Gardens, 600 feet to the west, are almost completely destroyed by these 4 and 8 ton structural steel sections. Steel frame is completely broken up into its individual components almost entirely. In other words, it's cut up, ready for loading and shipment, which is one of the goals of controlled demolition. Compare that incredibly explosive destruction to the nice, neat pile that is Building 7, a classic implosion, versus the very explosive event of the Twin Towers. Let's look at these squibs, or isolated explosive ejections, and see how they could be explained in the official story or not. Here and here and here, 20, 40, even 60 stories down below the explosive destruction of the towers, we have these isolated explosive ejections, which Nist calls air being pushed out of the building by that top section. Well, we saw that top section was destroyed in the first 3 seconds. There's no piston driving air down the elevator hoistways, but let's say there were. And this air pressure is built up in these hoistways. Well, the hoistways, those hoistways are surrounded by gypsum board. And then that air pressure would have to blow through that gypsum board and then into the open office space, where it would blow out all the windows, if any of them. Not these highly focalized, pinpoint accurate, violent ejections that are occurring at 150 to 200 feet per second. And we see the solids in these ejections. They're not puffs of air. This is smoke, clearly indicating, in that case, smoke even down below 60 stories, even down below the destruction that we're told is a gravitational collapse. And here in the South Tower, we have dozens of explosions, individual explosions, destroying the integrity of the structure of this building, such that it begins to fall over to the right, but then it actually begins to right itself as its center of mass and stability begin to shift. Let's look at these a minute with physics teacher David Chandler.
Here I'm measuring the ejection velocity of a squib on the east face of the South Tower. At this angle, there is foreshortening, but the calibration distance is foreshortened by the same proportion. Plotting horizontal position versus time, the slope indicates the ejection velocity, which is 67 meters per second, or 150 miles per hour.
How fast is that? It's 160 to 200 feet per second in this case. This is not air being pushed out. This is explosive speeds. Let's look at how fast the building comes down. We can actually time it for you. On the left, a timer. On the right, an animation. 5 seconds. 7 seconds. 8. And the timer's messing up. Anyway, both of the towers are down to the ground in about a dozen seconds. So what does that mean? How fast is this? Let's go back to David Chandler, physics teacher.
We are here tracking the motion of the roofline at 0.2 second intervals through approximately 32 meters or 8 stories. This graph shows the height of the roof line as a function of time. The analysis is simpler if we plot velocity as a function of time. On this kind of a graph, a straight line indicates constant acceleration. First note that there is a sudden onset of collapse, as the point we are tracking makes a sudden transition from being at rest to an approximately constant downward acceleration. The slope of the graph indicates that the acceleration is 6.31 meters per second squared downward, which is 64% of free fall.
64% of free fall. In other words, it is accelerating faster and faster each second down the building. It's not slowing down, it is getting faster. And it is getting faster and faster, even though there's a massive set of cold, hard, intact steel resisting any gravitational collapse. So it doesn't make sense. And even if it were steel that's resisting, the properties of steel columns are such that even after they buckle, they still give resistance. In fact, up to 25% of the resistance that they were capable of before they began buckling. So they should have slowed this building down, but they didn't. Let's look at it another way. We have a 15-story section of building above the point of jet plane impacts and held up on the right over nothing but air. The same building portion held up by this magic giant crane, held up over, say, 80,000 tons of structural steel framing that's 3 to 5 times stronger than it needed to be to resist this upper block falling onto it. We'll even take out, like Besant did from Chicago Northwestern University in the 2 days after 9/11, take out those 12-foot high columns, 300 of them. Just remove them so we can get a dynamic load on the building. What happens when we release these at the same time? Well, the one on the right, this is like 7th grade physics, right? We get this, is going to fall at free fall acceleration. The one on the left is going to impact and greatly slow down and most likely stop almost immediately given all of that structure below it. But Nist tells us that they hit the ground virtually at the same time. In fact, Nist actually said that they fall at free fall, which isn't technically accurate, but they actually admitted that. Let's look at it another way with Massimo Mizuko's September 11 New Pearl Harbor.
Something of this kind is what we should have seen when the top section of the towers collapsed onto the lower one. The upper and lower sections should have mutually destroyed each other until all the energy is dissipated and the system comes to a rest. Alternatively, as shown in this experiment with 2 towers made of snow, the top section could have fallen off to the side after the initial collapse. What could not have happened is this.
A little tiny chunk of the building can't possibly fall and crush the entire structure below it.
This is such a simple, fundamental concept that architects and engineers were astonished in seeing it totally ignored by Nist.
This is high school physics, and our whole society is being led to believe that these fundamental laws of physics, hard science, don't apply anymore.
But of course they do apply, and that's why we had at least one paper that was published by Gregory Zudolinski, Anthony Zambodi, and Richard Johns in the Journal of Protective Structures, challenging once again the official story about these buildings. So that one got through. Now, do we have the total shattering of the structural steel frame, feature number 6 of typical controlled demolition? Well, the National Fire Protection Guide 921 for Fire and Explosion Investigation, a guide which Nist actually helped to produce. So they should have known to look for shrapnel effects, one of the effects of explosions, high-order damage, characterized by the shattering of the structure, producing small pulverized debris, with the building completely demolished and debris thrown great distances. This should have been a complete alert to explosive destruction here, with the shrapnel effects completely evident throughout World Trade Center, shattering the structure all the way down to its individual elements almost, and reducing most of these core columns to their original 37.5-foot lengths. In other words, broken up, ready for loading and shipment. How about the lateral ejection of these structural steel components? Because the NFPA 921 again says look for blast pressure wave effects. What do we mean here? Well, heavy structural steel pieces freely flying. Do we have that? Yeah, we have that everywhere, impaled on buildings all around the World Trade Center. As you can see, these are freely flying structural steel sections weighing 4 and 8 tons each, individually, freely flying. This is not like a banana peeling. These are individually freely flying structural steel sections. Well, I thought that, wait a minute, that's going out, back, 2, forward, 2. That's 45 degrees. How does gravity work? Down. What force propelled this 4-ton structural steel section out? Remember? Physics. Something else is going on here. In fact, let's look at the physics of this with, again, David Chandler, physics teacher. Uh-oh. Let's try to get back on track and see if we can get that video to play for you. I can't. Okay, what we're going to do is go back and restart the slideshow from that slide and see if we can make that work. Here we go.
Girders weighing several tons were found 600 feet from the base of the North Tower. How fast they were ejected depends on where they originated. If they came from high in the building, they were thrown outward at about 50 miles per hour. If they came from lower down, the speed had to be even greater. Gravity alone cannot account for such high lateral ejection speeds. I'm here measuring the horizontal speed of what appears to be one or more wall units, which are being thrown northward from the North Tower. Because it was recorded by a handheld camera, I had to first stabilize the image. Then I did the measurements from the stabilized version of the video. Final result, 35 meters per second, which is 78 miles per hour. Girders weighing several tons were found.
So this is enough energy to hurl a 200-pound cannonball 3 miles. Where's that energy coming from? And there's thousands of these wall units that were hurled outward. By the way, since that happened, if 100,000 tons of steel framing is distributed well outside the tower's footprint, we have an obvious question here to ask. What's crushing the building? It's not the steel. It's way outside the footprint. It's not available to crush the building. That's a good third of the weight of this building. You say, oh, the concrete floors. We'll come back to that, okay? Stand by. In fact, we'll come back to it right now because the concrete is missing at the bottom. There's not 100,000 or 90,000 tons of concrete in each of these buildings stacked up like pancakes. On the right, you see pancakes. On the left, you see a 2-3 story pile of twisted steel. So where are the concrete floors? It's missing. Here it is. It's pulverized in midair. Now, what's pulverizing 90,000 tons of concrete? starting at the very top of the collapse. All the photos, all the videos show that 90,000 tons of concrete has been pulverized to a fine powder, 100 micron particles in this 3-inch thick blanket of concrete from river to river across lower Manhattan in a 3 square mile area. The dust analysis finds up to 30% of this dust is powdered concrete. Let's go to Governor Pataki.
And you see, and there's no concrete. There's very little concrete. All you see is aluminum and steel.
What happened to the concrete?
The concrete was pulverized. And I was down here Tuesday, and it was like you were on a foreign planet. All of lower Manhattan, not just this site, from river to river, there was dust powder 2-3 inches thick. The concrete was just pulverized.
You have 2 110-story office buildings. You don't find a desk. You don't find a chair. You don't find a telephone, a computer. The biggest piece of a telephone I found was half of the keypad, and it was about this big. The building collapsed to dust.
What I expected to see was nothing like what I actually did see at the time of my arrival at the site. There wasn't much that you could say, you could describe. Everything was dust and metal. There was no typewriters, there was no chairs, there was no nothing.
Well, interesting. If we have 90,000 tons of concrete pulverized and spread over 3 square miles, what's crushing the building? Wasn't the steel. That's outside the footprint. It's not the concrete. That's spread over 3 square miles. That's most all the weight of the building. There's not a lot of heavy stuff left. Gypsum boards spread out throughout all the dust too. They did find one file cabinet, but it survived because it was in the basement. One file cabinet out of probably tens of thousands of file cabinets in this building. The others pulverized as well. What happened to the people?
In April 2006, New Yorkers were distressed to learn that bone fragments, human remains from 9/11, had been found on the roof of the nearby Deutsche Bank building.
And how, in God's name, did those fragments get there?
And bone fragments less than a centimeter long. How could they be so small?
Wait a minute. We have 700 bone fragments found a half an inch long on top of this building. Whoops. Here. Well, they didn't come from the people in this airplane that hit the South Tower. Those ejections went out this way. They didn't come from the people in this airplane, which hit the North Tower. Those ejections were blocked from hitting the top of the tower, Deutsche Bank building, by the South Tower. So they're not from the planes. Many of them were from firefighters, actually, found indicated by the red triangles here on top of the building. But the firefighters, of course, weren't on the scene at the time of the plane impacts. So let's figure this out. There was 2,753 victims altogether, as we're told. But only 300 whole bodies were found. 21,900 pieces of bodies found altogether out of 2,700 victims. 6,000 of them were small enough to fit into a test tube. 200 pieces were matched to one single person. And yet, still, more than 1,100 victims remain completely unaccounted for. They were vaporized. The victims' data tracking base shows that these body parts were up to 800 feet outside the Twin Towers. How did they get so small? How did they get so far away? Can gravitational collapse possibly explain that? No, we'd expect to see mangled bodies trapped between concrete floors that are pancaking. What are we looking at here? Are these 8 characteristic and very uncharacteristic features, by the way, of controlled demolition? Does fire explain any one of these features, let alone all of them? Does that make any sense whatsoever? Especially these fires, diminished at the time of the collapse, thick black smoke indicating oxygen-starved, and cooler fires. We looked at the testimony of the first responders, 118 of them. Now, by the way, 156 first responders that are identified from that original research. It's been updated in 2015 by Graham McQueen. But there's another very important witness, and that's the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, 20 miles north of the World Trade Center. What did it detect? FEMA and Nist relied on this report, as we'll see. They say that the seismic signals at the time of the plane impacts were due to those planes. Well, that's intuitive, but let's look at it a little more carefully. The first impact producing a 0.9 magnitude earthquake, or seismic event, we'll call it. And the second impact into the South Tower, 0.7 magnitude impact. What happens here? The event occurs at 8:46 and 26 seconds. Okay. But the plane impacts, according to the NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board radar, doesn't occur for 14 seconds later. So how can the seismic event be caused by the planes? And the radar is to the second accurate. Well, Nist says, no, we studied the videos. We think the planes actually impacted 10 seconds before that. Well, wait a minute. That radar is to the second accurate. Well, they ignore that. And then they're left with 4 seconds still as a problem they have to solve. So what do? They go back to Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory and get them to move their data back 3 seconds. This is true. And there's a report produced, but we can't get our hands on it. They won't tell us why they moved their data back. We just know that they did. This is a public investigation. Should be under the greatest scrutiny, but that's hidden. Let's go to the South Tower. We're told, or the evidence shows, that the seismic event actually occurred at 9:02 and 54 seconds. Okay. But the plane impacts in this case don't occur for another 17 seconds. So how can it cause the seismic event? Again, the NTSB radar is accurate to within 1 second. Nist says, no, we looked at the videos. We did our own analysis. We think the radar is wrong. Wow. Okay. You're still 5 seconds off. What do you do about that? Well, we go back to Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory and get them to move that data also back 3 seconds. Wait a minute. Why? Can't tell you. Not going to tell you. This is called fraud in the scientific world. But there's so much emotional hysteria around 9/11 and control and gaslighting by the media and the government that nobody wants to question the official story, because that's questioning the integrity of our soldiers who we sent to war. So we can't do that. We've got to be patriotic and follow hook, line, and sinker the official story. Swallow it. So what could explain, if it wasn't the planes, what was going on? Well, there's some evidence here. Large explosions in the basement. Mike Porcaro, who said the whole building seemed to shake and there was a loud explosion. When they arrived at the sea level of the basement, they found the machine shop gone. Did you hear anything about explosions in the basement? Not unless you've done your own research, because it's not in the media. Nothing there but rubble, Mike said. We're talking about a 50-ton hydraulic press gone. They made their way to the parking garage, found it too was gone. No walls, rubble on the floor. You can't see anything. Huge explosions in the basement. A steel concrete door weighed 300 pounds, wrinkled up like a piece of aluminum foil. A bomb had gone off in the basement. Now, when did that bomb go off in the basement? Well, here's a witness that begins to talk about that. Willie Rodriguez, a janitor in the building, who was hailed as a hero by the Bush administration for saving so many lives.
I was a janitor. Like I said, on that day, there was an explosion in the basement, and this is prior to the building got hit by the plane, and then the plane hit.
I think a bomb went off in the lobby first, then a plane hit the building.
The bomb hit the lobby first, and a couple of seconds in the first plane hit.
So there's bombs in the lobby also, in addition to the basement. In fact, I will add another video here about that testimony, further clarifying it. Well, there's another expert on geophysics, and he's the author of 50 published papers on progressive mechanical waves in geology, Andre Rousseau. In 2012, he studied this. He says the frequency of the Raleigh waves, seismic waves, the main ones, were only on the order of 1 hertz, 1 cycle per second. Aircraft impacts create much higher frequencies, 10 to 100 hertz. And those frequencies were filtered out by the filters used by LDEO. They're only interested in explosions and earthquakes, mostly earthquakes, which explosions resemble. So they couldn't even pick up an aircraft impact, is what they're saying here. The seismic equipment's designed to detect seismic events around 1 hertz. So he also says the actual waves generated by the crash had to have been deadened even before hitting the ground. Even if they could pick up those frequencies of seismic signals, they wouldn't have. So let's go to the South Tower collapse, because there was also a signal at the time of the collapse. They say this is due to debris hitting the ground that caused the seismic signal. Okay, a reasonable hypothesis, but let's look into it a little deeper. That was the South Tower, 2.1 magnitude event. North Tower, 2.3 magnitude event. We'll get back to that discrepancy later. But let's look at the North Tower first. The surface waves come in at 10:28 and 31 seconds. Okay. The tower starts its descent 9 seconds earlier. Okay. The first debris hits the ground about a second after the seismic signal. Not so good anymore. But the heaviest debris doesn't hit the ground for another 4 seconds. So 5 seconds after. Well, yeah. And so how can the heaviest debris hitting the ground 5 seconds after cause the seismic signal 5 seconds earlier? Can't happen. So what does Nist do? They go back to LDEO yet again and get them to move their data 3 seconds. Can we see why? No. Again, this is hidden in a report. It remains unavailable to the public. And since it's a university, we can't even put forth a Freedom of Information Act request to get it. Also, with regard to the North Tower, we have very highly defined primary and shear waves. These are the Raleigh waves, the big ones. There's something else happening here many seconds earlier. 4 seconds earlier is the primary wave, earlier than the start of the tower's descent. Well, what can happen here? We have evidence of explosions occurring prior to the collapses. You heard dozens of them yourself today. Explosions felt by these first responders, the oral histories. And there's 200 altogether or so of witnesses of explosions. And we're going to show you here 6 and 10 seconds prior to the tower's start of descent, just like the firefighters described, evidence of explosions. First here on the North Tower, picked up by this camera from a mainstream media outlet 6 seconds before the collapse. Let's watch. So here, there's the shake, and 6 seconds later, the tower comes down, corroborating the expert witnesses we saw earlier. Let's go to another tripod-mounted camera on the top of this roof, looking almost straight on at the North Tower. There's the shake there. And in this case, 10 seconds later, and the building drops. So we have a different type of witness here, attesting and corroborating the first responders. Now, in the case of the South Tower, we have a similar situation. The start of the seismic event occurs at 9:59 and 04. The start of the tower collapses about 5 seconds earlier than that. And the heaviest debris, the first debris, doesn't even start until 7 seconds after that signal. What does Nist do? They go back to LDEO yet again and move the entire set of data back 3 seconds. So it corroborates, it corresponds to their official story, synchronizes. We don't get to know what that is about. Well, what could explain it? Again, we have yet another camera on the ground. And this research, by the way, is performed by Professor McQueen in Canada. In 2009, he did this research. And it shows what? That TV station New York 1 has this tripod-mounted camera on the ground looking at the South Tower. More subtle in this case. Look for the shake. There it is. And then, is it 6 seconds later? In this case, I think 3 seconds later, the building comes down. So, yet again, we're corroborating the first responders. Now, we have another problem. They say it's due to the debris hitting the ground, but come on, the concrete floors, the floor trusses, the gypsum board walls, and the building contents were pulverized almost to dust. So there's no seismic component from those. The steel frame is shattered to individual wall units, 4 to 8 tons each, and peppering the ground over 12 to 15 seconds. It's not even hitting the ground, actually. It's hitting a 7-story concrete basement that's further dampened from hitting the ground and thus transmitting seismic components. So there's no seismic component from the debris of the World Trade Center that could possibly make it 20 miles north. And we have another problem here too. We have identical buildings and identical collapses, and yet dramatically different seismic strengths attributed to them by Nist. The North Tower, the South Tower is producing a 2.1 magnitude event. The North Tower is producing a 2.3 magnitude event. Well, that's 1.6 times greater energy. How can that energy be possibly be released? That difference cannot be accounted for with the collapse alleged to have caused the seismic signals. It's the logarithmic scale. If you're wondering how the math works here, it is 1.6 times greater energy. So Andre Rousseau concludes that identical buildings and nearly identical collapses can't possibly produce seismic events of extremely different energy releases on an order of magnitude. Makes sense. This is documented, by the way, also on the Consensus 9/11, the best 9/11 evidence, which is co-produced by Elizabeth Woodworth and David Ray Griffin. Point TT7, why did the towers collapse? The seismic evidence. Encourage you to go to consensus911.org and learn a whole lot more about evidence beyond the scope of architects and engineers for 9/11 truth. By the way, some people say, well, there should have been a much greater magnitude Earth seismic event at the Twin Towers. After all, the Seattle Kingdom produced a 2.3 magnitude event, and the Twin Towers should have produced much, much greater because they're so much larger. Well, you have the limiting factors that I just described in the case of the towers. In the case of the concrete dome, the Seattle Kingdom, we have a 25,000-ton concrete roof, which impacts the ground virtually at once. So keep that in mind when you hear spurious arguments from spurious people about trying to compare these apples and oranges. So these reports are quite readily available for you to look at and do your own research, which I encourage you always to do. The data from the FEMA and Nist reports can be very helpful too. The Nist report had $20 million supporting it, and they had some very specific objectives that they were tasked with by Congress to determine how and why World Trade Center 1 and 2 collapsed. But apparently they had their own objective, which was hidden in footnote 13 on page 82 of their final report. The focus of the investigation was on the sequence of events from the instant of aircraft impact to the initiation of collapse. What? What do you mean? What about after initiation? It doesn't actually include structural behavior of the tower after the conditions for collapse initiation were reached. Wait a minute. You did $20 million of work and you only took it to the beginning of the collapse? Why would you not have done an analysis, as Tony Zambotti, for instance, had done, and others, to show if this building could even collapse? Well, they would have found that it couldn't have, so they didn't do it. They had 10,000 pages, including 1,000 pages on modeling the airplanes, 100 pages on life modeling and fire modeling and life safety issues, and only a half a page on the task that they were tasked by Congress to do. The events follow the actual collapse? Well, they had a half a page. Let's look at it. The structure below the level of collapse initiation offered minimal resistance. The large building mass far exceeded the capacity of the intact structure below to absorb it. The building came down essentially in free fall. Floors below were unable to arrest the moving mass. Wait a minute. This is pure speculation. There is no analysis with supporting calculations. It's a pre-collapse report. It should have been titled "The Final Report on the Initiation of Collapse." So we submit requests for correction, which we've been doing with Nist, and they acknowledge we were unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse of the Twin Towers. Only speculation, really, no analysis. And they say also, by the way, they found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used. Well, wait a minute. Did you look? A year later, when pressed, they finally admit in writing Nist did not test for the presence of explosive residue. Well, you can't test what you won't look for, but others did. And we'll talk about that next week. But first, let's go to the experts like William Rice, because this is the reason we have 100 structural engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation. The prevailing theory would have us believe that each of the Twin Towers inexplicably collapsed upon itself while crushing 287 massive columns on each floor, and while maintaining a near free fall acceleration, as if the 80,000 or more tons of supporting structural steel underneath didn't even exist. Very well said. And this structural engineer, near free fall collapse violates laws of physics. You can memorize that one. And Scott Granger, fire protection engineer, all three collapses are very uniform in nature. Natural collapses, due to unplanned events, are not uniform. Very intuitive. Van Romero, explosives expert at the Energetic Materials Research and Testing Center. Effects of explosions on buildings is what they do there. He says explosive devices cause the collapse of both towers. Too methodical to be a chance result of airplanes colliding with the structures. After the airplanes hit the World Trade Center, there were some explosive devices inside the buildings that caused the towers to collapse. Well, he got some pressure, which caused him to reverse himself on this position, as did Mathis Levy, who originally said this.
If you've seen many of the managed demolitions where they implode a building and they cause it essentially to fall vertically because they cause all of the vertical columns to fail simultaneously. That's exactly what it looked like, and that's what happened.
Yeah, and this gentleman, Ronald Hamburger, who worked with FEMA, but before that he said, it appeared to me that charges have been placed in the building. But apparently somebody told him that no bombs were detonated. He said, I was very surprised. Well, we've seen all kinds of evidence that bombs were detonated. Mike Taylor, the collapse of the World Trade Center towers looked like a classic controlled demolition, mirroring the strategy used by demolition experts. In a controlled demolition, explosives are placed not just on the lowest 3 floors, but also on several consecutive floors, about a third of the way up the building. It cascaded down like an implosion. And seismic expert, we just heard from earlier, he says, even if the plane impacts and the fall of the debris from the towers onto the ground could have generated seismic waves, their magnitude would have been insufficient to be recorded 20 miles north and should have been very similar in the two cases to one another, but they were not. Controlled demolition is confirmed and demonstrated. What about the evidence left behind? Surely it was preserved in easily the 3 most perplexing structural failures in history. But here's Abolhassan Astani Azal, a structural engineer who had a National Science Foundation grant to study the steel. What does he say about what happened to it?
after 9/11, realized that Port Authority of New York and New Jersey has sent all the steel that we need to study. That's why I'm here to study steel. Has sent all the steel to recycling plant to go to China for recycling. For what? For 15 cents a pound. Just nothing. And all the evidence of steel went to melting pot.
After 9/11.
Wait a minute. All the evidence of the steel went to the melting pot, to China, for recycling. Before structural engineers and forensic investigators could get their hands on it and to do a proper forensic investigation, prompting Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, to cry out crucial evidence that could answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. But it didn't. In fact, we have 400 truckloads a day starting just 2 weeks after 9/11, carting the steel off to the landfill to be put on these barges to go to China. This is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene, which is why we started off using the scientific method to get to the bottom of this crime. After all, it is a crime, the crime of the century. So in your digesting of this evidence, what do you find to be true relative to the hypothesis that is corroborated by the evidence? Is it jet planes and fire? Or is it explosions and controlled demolition? We want to know what you think, because we believe that we have shown the 8 characteristic and very uncharacteristic features of controlled demolition, destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create any of these features, let alone all of them. With additional circumstantial corroborative testimony, we believe that we have shown proof today of controlled demolition. But let us know what you think, and you can also ask us a question. How do they do that, Andy? Andy, go ahead. There you are. I hear your mic, so you can start talking. No, can't hear you right now. Where'd you go? You're off mute. I hear your mic. Go ahead and talk. Okay, Andy's working that out. You can certainly find us on the website at ae911truth.org /continuing-ed. And you can put your questions right in there. While you're there, subscribe, because we put out a couple, 3 times a month important bulletins letting you know what the latest evidence we have, how we're packaging it, trying to get a new investigation, the successes that we're having toward getting a real investigation here. So you want to put your email in there. It takes a minute, and get informed with our incredible evidence section. Sign the petition demanding a new investigation. Even if you're not an architect or engineer, there are 20,000 others that support these architects and engineers. You can be one of those too. So please sign up on our website there and donate if you can't. If you can. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization, so you have a tax-deductible donation, and we're funded by you, nobody else. We don't get grants from corporations or certainly the government. So it's individuals that see the need for a real investigation, understand the impact on our society that 9/11 had, understand what a false flag operation is, where one country attacks itself and blames it on another or another group, in this case, Al-Qaeda, who clearly didn't have the capability to pull off the degree of destruction and sophistication that the evidence we've shown today reveals. So we want you to support us. You can become a member for as little as a cup of coffee a month. You can become a member of AE911 Truth. So join the family of sustaining supporters. And if you can't do that, we encourage you to volunteer. Andy, what are the opportunities for volunteering with AE 9/11 Truth?
I'll be happy to go over them. I just want to make sure everybody can hear me now.
Yeah, you sound great.
All right, there we go. Sorry, my microphone must have got unplugged during the presentation there. So yes, volunteering, and a lot of the work that we do comes from people who have answered the call and stepped up and did whatever they could do to get this information out. A lot of what you do depends on what you are comfortable with doing. As I say every week, we all got different personalities, things we want to do and things we may not be as comfortable as doing, but we got a place for everyone. So if you're somebody who likes to sit around and do research quietly in your apartment, or if you're somebody who likes to reach out and talk to people on the phone, we got something for you to do here. And so please get involved with that, because we need so many people to help us out, especially for our push towards Congress that we're going to be making in this coming spring as well, to try to get them on board. And we might be needing some help with that. So the first step is go to ae911truth.org. There's a volunteer form on there. It's very easy to fill out, and just fill it out, and within a couple of days we'll get in touch with you and see where you can help us.
Perfect. And by the way, you can also work on your own. Maybe you like to work on your own. Hey, send our information, our website, ae911truth.org, and our materials to every architect and engineer that you can find, everybody else that you know. Contact your radio, television, newspapers. Let people know that there's 3,400 architects and engineers demanding a new investigation. Are they all conspiracy theorists? Highly unlikely. Tell everybody you know. Screen the AE 9/11 Truth DVDs. I'll show you an example of one in a minute. Share our brochures one-on-one. You can get 100 of them for $10 in our store, which is online. Share and download the evaluation, the finite element analysis that Professor Leroy Hulsey, one of the top forensic structural engineers in the University of Alaska, he performed with his PhD candidates these detailed analysis, the work that Congress hired Nist to do, but which Nist failed at miserably, as you saw in last week's episode, which is free online for you to watch, of 9/11 An Architect's Guide, Part 1. And so that film is going to be made available for free soon, but until then, you can watch it at Hoodoo or Voodoo, I think it is, and Amazon Prime. It's not free yet, but you can still watch it there, and get the link to it on our website, ae911truth.org/7. I think it is. And maybe you could verify that for me, Andy. Is /7 or /building7 or something very much like that.
I'm not sure. I got to look that up.
Yeah, I'm supposed to memorize that myself. But before you do, Andy, tell us about the Bobby McElveen Act, because this is important.
Absolutely. I think this is actually going to be the final nail in the coffin when we get justice on this issue. This is the Bobby McElveen Act. World Trade Center Investigation Act is the full title. But it's named after Bobby McElveen. You see him right there. He was killed by an explosion as he was entering the lobby of the North Tower on the morning of September 11th. That doesn't really jive well with the official story. So right there, you got an opening conversation piece with your members of Congress to discuss why we need this new investigation. And that's what this act does. It gives us the investigation that the American people deserve. And it's written in such a way that they can't just throw out the official story again and put another rubber stamp on it. They actually have to look into the evidence that Richard is bringing forth. But as I say every week, members of Congress don't do something they'd rather not do unless they get a lot of pressure from their constituents. So that's where you get involved. Quickest way to get involved is first learn about the act. You can do that by going to ae911truth.org/justice. There you can download the act. You can actually write to your members of Congress through an online form. We got a lot set up there for you to do. And we're asking people to try to set up meetings over the phone with their members of Congress. It's very easy to do. You just contact your members of Congress. You fill out the forms that they usually have. Tell them that you want to meet with their staffers, and yourself, and members of AE 9/11 Truth over the phone. That's sort of the the silver lining in the current world events and crises is that they're doing all their meetings over the phone, so we don't have to fly to Washington, D.C. to do them. But you request it over the phone, and we've done a lot of these so far, Richard. So we think we're making a good headway and at least getting the information out before them. So that's how you get involved, and please do consider doing so, because when they pass this new investigation, this is going to be the legislation that they take up.
Yeah, right on. There's a lot of work that we're doing here at AE. In addition to that, we have a grand jury investigation that we've been promised by the U.S. Attorney in Manhattan. And to learn more about that at ae911truth.org/grand jury. And the FBI has been sued because they've got our evidence and they didn't give it to Congress. They were required to do so. Learn more about that at /FBI. Learn more about the Matt Campbell effort to get justice for his brother Jeff, and that is ae911truth.org/inquest. We've raised $100,000 for the best attorney in London, and they are submitting it imminently. Very exciting. And we've made a landmark documentary which we want you to watch, but I'm just going to show you a couple of minutes so you can get a sense of it. You can watch it for free on YouTube, actually. Or you can get the DVD here. Take a look.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. There are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what Nist has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dus dit is Control Demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red ray crystals are very high temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined. and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
Yeah, you can watch it right now. It's free on YouTube. Or you can get the DVD, which we encourage you to get because it has the additional bonus DVD, Meet the Experts, extended interviews with each of these 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, control demolition experts, all laying out the evidence here that we've been talking about today. You can also download our 50-page booklet on this subject, What Science Says About the Destruction of World Trade Center 1, 2, and 7, beyondmisinformation.org. Go there and download it, or get the coffee table version, a real high-quality production with a DVD inside of it of experts speak out. So take advantage of these resources. Our classic lecture on this series is free on YouTube, 9/11 Blueprint for Truth, as is the 15-minute version of Ed Asner's narrated documentary on World Trade Center 7. But let's get to your questions. Andy, I'm guessing we have some.
Yeah, we do. We actually have 3 questions today, and they're all from Facebook. First one asks, what happened to the hat truss at the top? Did it stay together?
I have not seen any evidence of the hat truss in the pile. It may be there, pieces of it anyway. It's certainly not there in any way, shape, or form, semi-intact or intact. So, Andy, do you have any additional information about that?
No, I do not. That is a good question.
Yeah, it was probably destroyed just like the rest of the World Trade Center, severed individual member from individual member. So look for those pieces down on the bottom. I have not seen them myself. If anybody has any information about that, I'd love to include that in the presentation. Yeah, we're looking to make this altogether. This presentation is about 5 hours long. So we're trying to get it up to 6 or 7 or 8 hours, right, Andy?
As much information as you can include to debunk these people. I think we've already covered it. Some of these questions we get, I think we ought to send them into the courtroom with Graham Sunder on the stand there. All right, this is an interesting question. What do you tell people who think the building was made weakly, that it wasn't certified properly, was a mafia build with corrupt certifications?
This is certainly a major complaint of a minor component of survivors, or family members of the victims, who have hired Abolhassan Astani Azal, a structural engineer that we took a quote from earlier, to represent them, who claims that these buildings were shoddy construction. There's, in my mind, very little evidence to support that. These buildings were very robustly built, even according to Nist. It is the robustness of these buildings and the structural engineering has been lauded by Nist, and I find no reason to doubt that. People can look at the specifics of that complaint, but it's irrelevant, actually, no matter what you come up with, whether they were shoddy or not. What we've been looking at is very specific forensic evidence of the destruction of these buildings by explosives. So it doesn't matter how they were built. Do you agree, Andy, or do you have other thoughts?
Well, yeah, and I mean, ditto to everything that you said, and then there's also the physics aspects of it, where you have the building falling through itself, essentially at free fall, as Nist itself even says. So even getting past the building construction of it, there's physics elements that can't be refuted simply by saying that it was poor quality. But that is interesting. I wasn't even aware that they were bringing that suit there. All right. Last question says, AE 911 Truth. You guys should put out videos debunking the debunkers. People look up those to argue against your work.
Well, you know who's done a great job of that is Massimo Mizuko. He's got an hour of his 5-hour DVD debunking the specific debunkers, some of the most famous ones from all around. And we did have a debate with a debunker on this subject. The oral recording, audio recording, is available. My debate with one of them, Chris. Is it Chris? Oh, dear. I didn't forget his name. From Boulder, Colorado, or Denver, Colorado. We had a very interesting debate. And so I encourage you to look at that. We put out responses to debunkers all the time. We've taken on, I forget their names because they pop up every once in a while. Do you remember any of them offhand, Andy?
Well, basically, I mean, there was the steel worker, which I didn't really consider that some kind of A-class debunker, but the corporate media ran with it as an angle to try to go after us. And of course, Richard debunked him pretty well. And we have taken on people at times. I mean, there's so many videos out there, it would be impossible to just respond to everything. So if somebody is at some kind of high level where they're making a point that people might believe, we consider it. If it's a guy sitting in his mom's basement in his underwear, just shooting his mouth off, we'll probably ignore it.
Right. Well, this guy came out to the White House, coincidentally, a debunker he was the director, they called him, when he was debunking in his strong days. And we were at the White House doing a protest, basically. We had our brochures out there and our banners, and this is on 9/11, right in front of the White House, and he showed up. And this was all recorded, and it's up on YouTube. It's called, I didn't name it, but it's called Gage Hands Debunker His Ass. But anyway, that's something that you can look for on YouTube. And then the one I was thinking about was the one who talked about these iron spheres. We took him on and published that on our website. Mick Smith. Mick, what's his name? Andy will know.
Mick Harris? No.
Okay, what's his last name?
Mick West.
Mick West, yeah.
There you go. No.
It's coming to us now. Yeah, he's probably one of the more serious debunkers. So we've taken on several of his specific debunkings. It's kind of fun, but it's also a waste of time because we end up addressing his audience instead of ours. We don't get much response from those. Do you have any other thoughts about handling debunkers, Andy?
The guy who used to debate, I think, was Chris Moore. It just dawned on me.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Chris Moore. We had an audio recording of Chris Moore debate.
Right. I mean, again, what I said is that we're not going to take on every single person that puts an opinion out there on YouTube, because sometimes they're just ridiculous. But if somebody has something that is substantially kind of getting passed around and people are starting to believe, we'll consider it. I took on Michael Shermer one time it wasn't even really a scheduled debate. I just sort of interrupted him because he came to some event to promote his book in Oakland, and he didn't even know the official story that he was defending.
Yeah, they don't.
He was putting out things that were debunked even by Nist years ago. So I just kind of said that, and I told him, you don't even know the official story you're defending. You're out here trying to sell a book, and they caused a little bit of commotion, but I'm glad I got that in there.
Yeah, awesome. Michael Shermer's with the Skeptics magazine, and they're not skeptics of anything the government puts out. They're only skeptics of the truth tellers. So I don't know. It sounds like they're paid skeptics is what it seems like. It's very interesting. They'll support every element of the official story, down to their most obvious fraud. And it's you can tell they're working with somebody. It's very interesting.
Yes, it is. And I just want to acknowledge we got a shout out from a supporter out in Serbia saying, telling us to keep up the good work. I don't have the exact quote out there, but thank you. And it's nice to know that the information is getting there around the world.
Yeah, we like to get out there. We usually get about 1,000 to 2,000 to 4,000 in some cases views on this live stream. And maybe what do we get? At a single moment, we might get 20 to 100, something like that. Andy, can you see actually?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't looked at it today, but it really depends on what's going on. And we get a lot more people around September 11th as that comes around, or if we do something big, the view counts will go up. But it's important to have this resource out there. It started off as a way to educate architects and award them AIA credit and hold these seminars. We don't have the ability to award AIA credits anymore, but we continue doing it because people tell others about the 9/11 information, and this is an opportunity for people to be able to submit questions, not just watch a video, but to ask their specific questions at the end of it. We got it set up so I can't even see who's writing them in, so they can remain anonymous and not let anyone know that they're considering these possibilities in their heads. So it's a great opportunity for people to step in and refresh themselves on what Richard has to say and be able to get their questions answered. So we keep doing it.
Right on. And today we looked at part 2 of the 3-part 9/11 and Architect's Guide, the Twin Towers Explosive Destruction Today. Now, guess what? Next week at this time being 1 p.m. Pacific on Thursdays, on next Thursday, we look at the extreme heat. We're going to be looking at more detailed evidence in these fires. Hold on, I got messed up. There we go. The molten steel and iron evidence, the evidence of pyroclastic-like clouds, the iron microspheres, which are evidence of incendiaries, and the thermite and nanothermite unignited residue, that evidence. So be sure to join us. And then we start it all again come March with part 1 again. Every month we do the series. So they're all available on YouTube. So I encourage you to watch it there. So thanks everybody for joining us. Thanks for all the great help, Andy. And we'll catch up with you guys next week. Until then, bye for now.